My aunt cried, "Give up your share of Grandma's land. Your cousin needs it for his wedding and you have to be the bigger person." I pulled out the boundary survey and barked, "You mean the land you tried to quietly rezone? I recorded that call." I still remember the exact day the whole mess stopped being a family annoyance and turned into something I knew I had to treat like a business problem. It was a Sunday in late spring, and I was standing in my grandmother's old kitchen with a paper plate of dry casserole in my hand while my Aunt Carol tried to corner me by the sink. I had already spent most of the afternoon pretending not to notice how many times she kept bringing up my cousin Mason's wedding. At first, I thought she was just being annoyingly sentimental. That was what she always did when she wanted something. She would start with family memories, then slide into guilt, then act like I was the one creating drama if I did not instantly agree. The land itself was the real reason everyone was suddenly very interested in me. My grandmother had owned a little over 11 acres outside town, the kind of property that did not look like much from the road but meant everything if you grew up around it. There was an old farmhouse that had not been lived in for years, a barn leaning a little to the east, a patch of pecan trees, a creek along the back line, and a flat stretch by the road that everyone in the family had always treated like sacred ground for reunions, cookouts, and the occasional broken-down truck. When Grandma died, the will split the land between my mother's branch of the family and my Aunt Carol's branch. My mother was already gone, so my share came to me. Carol got her portion through my grandmother's estate. There was also a small part that had gone to my uncle, but he lived 2 states away and had basically washed his hands of the whole thing years ago. So it was mostly me and Carol left dealing with it. Or more accurately, it was mostly me doing the paperwork while she acted like she was the keeper of the family legacy. I was not emotionally attached to the land in some dramatic, movie-like way. I was attached to it in the practical way people get attached to things they have spent time maintaining. I had spent weekends there mowing, clearing trash, meeting surveyors, paying my portion of the county taxes after the estate settled, and making sure the place did not get quietly swallowed by weeds or opportunists. I had even replaced the locks on the barn after a few cousins started using it like a storage unit without asking anybody. I had not fought any of that because I thought it would eventually matter that I had stayed calm and documented everything. It turned out that mattered more than I expected. Mason, Carol's son, was getting married that summer. He was a decent guy overall, but he was also the kind of son who had never been told no in a way that stuck. He was 30, had bounced between jobs, and talked about wedding plans like he had invented adulthood. His fiancée came from a family with money, and suddenly everything around their wedding had to look polished and meaningful. At one point, Carol had decided Grandma's land would be the perfect place for an outdoor reception. She said it would be simple. She said it would honor family history. She said it would be the kind of thing Grandma would have loved. All of that might have been true in some vague emotional sense. The problem was that she had never asked me in a real way. She had mentioned it once or twice as if I would naturally hand over anything she wanted if she attached enough family language to it. Then she started acting as if my silence meant consent. That Sunday, she finally went from hinting to openly pushing. She had been circling me since lunch, and every time I tried to help clean up or step outside, she somehow found a reason to keep me in place. I remember her hands being wet from dishes, and her voice getting that sugary, tight tone she used when she thought she was being reasonable. She told me Mason needed the land for the wedding. She told me the family needed this to come together. She told me I had always been the practical one and should know when to be the bigger person. I remember looking at the sink, at the half-scrubbed pan, at the old yellow curtains Grandma had liked, and realizing I was being cornered in the kitchen of a dead woman's house so somebody else could save money on a venue. I said I needed time to think. That made her face change in a way I did not like. It was not anger exactly. It was more like she had expected obedience and now had to improvise. She told me there was no reason to think about it that much because it was only a share of land, not a kidney. She said Grandma would be disappointed if she knew we were acting greedy over family. That word hit me harder than it should have because greedy is what people call you when they want your stuff without looking like they want your stuff. I did not argue in the kitchen. That was one of the first decisions that helped me later. I was irritated, but I was still calm. I told her I would look at everything again before saying anything. She kept talking after that, but I stopped really listening. I had learned a long time ago that if somebody is trying to force a decision, the first thing you should protect is your pace. If they need your answer more than you need theirs, they are usually hiding something. At the time, I did not yet know what she was hiding. I just knew she was pushing too hard. That week, I went back to my own place and tried to forget about it. I had work, bills, a leaking faucet in my bathroom, and enough normal life problems to make land drama seem almost childish. I do accounting for a mid-sized distributor, which sounds boring because it is boring, and I liked it that way. I liked numbers because they did not flatter people or raise their voices. They were either right or wrong. I kept my own finances very plain and very organized. That habit probably saved me. On Wednesday, I got a notification in the mail from the county planning office. It was a public notice about a zoning review request connected to Grandma's property. I almost threw it into a stack of junk mail until I saw the parcel number. Then I sat down at my table and read it twice. The request was not a full rezoning yet. It was some kind of preliminary filing for a conditional use review tied to an events-related use. I did not understand every technical detail immediately, but I understood enough to know the property had been discussed in a formal government process without anybody asking me. That was the first real crack in the surface. I pulled out the deed copies I had saved from the estate records. I checked the tax statements. I compared the parcel maps. Then I called the planning office myself the next morning on my break. The woman who answered was polite in the exhausted way county employees often are. She told me the application had been submitted by Carol H. as a family representative. That phrase jumped out at me. Family representative was not an ownership category. It was just a word somebody had used to make themselves sound more legitimate. I asked whether all owners had signed. She said the file only showed one signature packet. She also said the proposal had been described as a small family event site for a wedding. That was the moment my annoyance started turning into suspicion. I did not accuse anyone yet. I just asked her to send me the public packet. She did. The packet was thin, but the signatures page was enough. Carol had signed as if she could speak for everyone. There was no notarized consent from me. There was no signature from the uncle who was still on record. There was no supporting ownership resolution. Nothing. I stared at that page for probably 10 minutes. I was not angry yet. I was more in that cold, half-disbelieving state you get when someone proves they were willing to lie in a small way, and you suddenly have to imagine what else they lied about. I called my cousin Mason that evening. Not to confront him, just to see how much he knew. He sounded cheerful and distracted. He thanked me for considering the land. That was the first clue that he had been told I might already be on board. He talked about a rustic ceremony, how his fiancée loved the idea of a family property venue, and how his mom had said I was being supportive. I remember staring at my own kitchen floor while he talked, realizing Carol had been speaking about me like my answer was already settled. I did not tell Mason everything. I told him I had not agreed to anything and that the property was not available for an event until all owners signed off. He went quiet in that embarrassed way people do when they realize a family story they repeated is not true. He said he would talk to his mom. I told him he should. He sounded uncomfortable but not defensive. That mattered. It told me he probably was not the mastermind. He was just standing too close to it. The next day, Carol called me. I did not answer immediately because I was at work and trying not to get distracted. She left a voicemail that was mostly about timing and family pressure and how the wedding deposits were already being discussed. I called her back on my lunch break. Before I did, I put the call on speaker and opened the recorder app on my phone. I had not planned to do that when the whole thing began. I did it because the county notice had made me uneasy, and because once I learned somebody had been filing paperwork around me, I wanted a record of whatever came next. I am glad I trusted that feeling. Carol started off sounding tired and offended, which was her preferred combination. She said I was making things harder than they had to be. She said the application was just a formality. She said the land could still stay in the family while being used for the wedding. She said I was acting like a landlord instead of a nephew. Then she slid into the emotional part. She said Mason had already invited people. She said his fiancée's family was expecting something special. She said Grandma would have wanted us to make this work. I let her talk. That is another thing I am glad I did. People who are manipulating a situation often reveal more than they realize if you do not interrupt them. After a minute or two, she said the reason she had filled out the packet the way she did was because the county did not need every heir making everything harder. That was almost enough by itself. Then she went a little further and said that if I would just give up my share or sign it over temporarily, the rest of them could get the rezoning cleaned up and move forward. I asked her what she meant by temporarily. She hesitated. That hesitation told me more than her answer would have. She then said the obvious thing about family needing flexibility, and that I had always been the sensible one. I asked directly whether she had filed the rezoning paperwork before talking to me. She said she had to keep things moving because the wedding date was coming fast. I asked whether the county knew I had not approved it. She said the county did not need to know every argument in the family. That was when I realized this was not about a wedding anymore. It was about control. She was trying to create facts, then force me to catch up with them. I kept my voice level. I told her I did not consent to any zoning action, any event use, or any representation that she spoke for me. Then I told her I needed a copy of everything she had submitted. That changed her tone immediately. She got defensive and said I was being difficult on purpose. She said I was punishing Mason for something that was not his fault. She said I should be the bigger person because the land was just sitting there. I remember that phrase landing like a slap, not because it hurt my feelings, but because it was such a lazy way to dismiss my ownership. When somebody calls your property idle, what they usually mean is they want it active for their own purposes. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse her of lying. I simply told her that I had recorded the call, and that if the county had been given inaccurate ownership information, we had a bigger problem than a wedding. There was a pause long enough that I could hear the fan in my office. Then she asked whether I was threatening family over paperwork. That question was so stupidly dishonest that it actually helped me. People who are bluffing often switch to moral language when facts stop helping them. I told her no, I was protecting my interest in inherited property. Then I ended the call. My hands were shaking a little after that, which annoyed me. I did not like being rattled, but my head was clear. I had the recording. I had the county notice. I had my deed copies, and now I knew the issue had moved from annoying family pressure to something I would need to document properly. That afternoon, I left work early and drove to the county records office. I spent 2 hours pulling copies of old plats, estate filings, and the most recent tax assessment. The woman behind the records counter looked amused when I asked for so many documents, but not suspicious. People probably ask for land paperwork more often than I had assumed. I found the original meets and bounds description from Grandma's deed. I found the old survey from decades ago. I found a newer marker map from a utility company that suggested one fence line on the west side had drifted several feet over the years. That detail would matter later. At the time, it just annoyed me, because it meant the property was one of those family lands where people gradually stop respecting the exact lines and start believing their version of the ground is the truth. I called a surveyor the next morning. He was recommended by a coworker who had gone through a messy fence dispute and said this guy was calm, detailed, and never rushed the client. That sounded like exactly what I needed. The surveyor came out 3 days later. I met him at the property on a Saturday morning with boots, a folder of copies, and a coffee I forgot to drink. He walked the land slowly, took measurements, checked the old markers, and compared them with the county records. He did not talk much while he worked, which I appreciated. A lot of men in this area think silence means they know everything. This guy was just focused. When he finished the first pass, he pointed out that the back boundary had never been where Carol had casually talked about it as if it were all hers to use. The usable flat area by the road was smaller than she had implied. The back grove, which she had talked about like a bonus wedding space, was actually split in a way that would have made any event setup complicated without permission from the adjoining owners. More importantly, the access path she had been clearing with her husband's trailer was not entirely within the portion she controlled. That was a real problem. It was not just a moral problem. It was a property problem. I asked him to send me everything in writing. He said he would. He also recommended I take photos of the cleared area and keep a dated file of anything that changed on the ground. I did exactly that. I took pictures of the tire tracks, the cut brush, the stakes they had driven in, and the little flagging tape tied to a tree near the creek. Then I went home and made a folder on my computer with the kind of organization my younger self would have mocked. I labeled everything by date. I saved the county notice. I saved the zoning packet. I saved the call recording. I saved the surveyor's first notes. I saved screenshots of Carol's text where she kept using vague language like we and our land. I was not trying to build a war chest. I was trying to build a truth file. There is a difference. The next week, Carol invited the whole extended family to dinner at her house. I almost did not go, but I had learned enough by then to know that missing the gathering would probably let her tell a cleaner version of the story without me there. So I went. The dinner itself was one of those awful family meals where everyone keeps pretending it is normal while the tension sits under the table like a dog waiting to bite. Mason was there. His fiancée was there. 2 aunts I barely knew were there. My uncle was on speakerphone from out of state because Carol had apparently told him this was a quick family update and he did not want to miss anything. Carol had cooked too much food and kept insisting everyone take more, which is what people do when they want to look generous before they start asking for something. She did not waste much time. She gave a little speech about tradition, family unity, and honoring Grandma's memory. Then she turned to me and said the practical thing needed to happen now. She said Mason had already put down deposits on a tent, chairs, and a caterer. She said the county filing was ready to move forward if I would simply sign the consent page. She said she had even arranged a notary to come by later that week so nobody would have to make extra trips. I remember looking around the table and realizing almost nobody there knew the rezoning packet had been filed without my permission. That part annoyed me more than her speech. She had not just tried to pressure me privately. She had built a social net around the lie so saying no would make me look like the obstacle. I asked her whether she had submitted a family ownership application with only her signature. She gave a tiny smile and said she had handled the preliminary step because somebody had to be responsible. I asked whether she had listed herself as the family representative. She said the county understood the situation. That was not an answer. It was a dodge. I asked whether she had told the county I had approved any of this. She said approval was a strong word. That answer got the attention of everyone at the table. Mason looked confused now, which meant he had probably heard a much cleaner version of events. His fiancée stopped eating. My uncle, still on speakerphone, asked what exactly was being approved. That was the first moment in the evening where Carol actually looked afraid, not because I had yelled, because I was calmly asking precise questions she could not easily escape. I told them I had not approved a rezoning application. I told them I had not approved use of the land for a wedding. I told them I had not signed any temporary transfer of rights, and that any paperwork implying otherwise was unauthorized. Carol immediately said I was being dramatic and making everything sound worse than it was. She said she had only tried to keep the family moving. Then she turned the guilt dial all the way up and said Mason's wedding was supposed to bring people together, not split them apart. I said the family could come together somewhere else. That answer angered her more than anything else I had said. She started saying I did not understand how much had already been spent. She said her son would look foolish if this fell apart now. She said I was acting like a stranger instead of family. Then came the line about being the bigger person. She said I had always been rational, and rational people do not ruin a wedding over a field that had been sitting empty for years. I remember feeling a strange kind of calm in that moment, not because I was fine with it, because I finally understood the shape of the game. She was treating my ownership like an inconvenience because she had convinced herself that my refusal would be socially more expensive than her dishonesty. That is a dangerous assumption to make about someone who keeps records. I told her the land was not sitting empty. I told her it was being maintained and taxed, and that she was standing on the edge of using a false ownership representation to pressure me into giving up inherited property. Then I took the folder I had brought and laid the survey copy on the table. I did not slam it down. I placed it gently in front of her. That might sound theatrical, but it was actually the opposite. I wanted the facts to sit there quietly and do the damage on their own. I pointed to the boundary line she had been talking around for weeks. I pointed to the access path. I pointed to the part where the survey did not match the way she had been describing the property. Carol stared at the paper for a long second and then said surveys could be wrong. That was such a weak response that one of my aunts actually made a small noise of disbelief. I pulled out the county packet next. Then I showed the page with her signature. Then I showed the section where the application described the parcel as family-owned and available for event use. Then I showed the part where the packet had gone forward without any consent from me or the uncle. The room got very quiet. Mason finally asked whether his mother had really filed all of that without telling me properly. Carol said she had been managing the family side because I was hard to get a hold of. That was a lie and not even a very good one. I answered emails. I answered calls. I answered text messages about anything that was actually a matter of record. What I did not do was let other people speak for me. My uncle, still on the speakerphone, asked her directly whether she had assumed ownership authority she did not have. She got defensive and said everybody was making a federal case out of one wedding application. That phrase told me enough. She still did not think she had done anything truly wrong. She thought she had just moved ahead in a practical way and gotten caught before the family could smooth it over. That realization was almost worse than if she had openly admitted bad intent. People who think they are entitled to step around you rarely understand why you stop trusting them. I left dinner before it devolved into shouting. I had no interest in giving her the satisfaction of a big scene. On the way out, Mason caught up with me in the driveway and looked embarrassed enough to be genuine. He told me he had not known the application went in that way. He said his mom had told him I was okay with most of it but needed time on the final signature. He also said the wedding could be moved. I believed him. He did not sound like a man defending his mother. He sounded like someone realizing he had been given a neat lie and had built plans on top of it. I told him I was sorry the family had put him in that position, but that I was not backing down from my share. Then I went home and slept badly. The next few days were a blur of practical tasks. I called the surveyor back and ordered the full final report. I sent the county planning office a formal letter stating that I had not consented to the application and that any representation otherwise was false. I copied my uncle on everything. I spoke with a property attorney recommended by the same coworker who had suggested the surveyor. The attorney was a calm woman with a blunt way of cutting through nonsense. She reviewed the paperwork and told me Carol had overstepped in a way that was not just rude but legally dangerous. She said a zoning application based on incomplete ownership authorization could be withdrawn or challenged. She also said if Carol had knowingly misrepresented ownership status to the county, that could create real trouble for her. I remember asking her whether I was overreacting. She looked at me like that was not even a serious question and told me no, I was underreacting in the way a lot of decent people do when they hope family will eventually straighten itself out. That stung because it was true. The attorney suggested I send a cease and desist style letter regarding any use of my share for event planning and any further representation that I had consented. She also suggested I preserve the call recording. I had not even told Carol yet that I knew the rezoning filing had not been a harmless mistake. I wanted her to keep talking long enough for the story to become impossible for her to clean up. The county hearing was scheduled for the following month. That gave me time to keep collecting details. I obtained the final survey, which confirmed the old lines more clearly than the rough pass had. The report showed that the area Carol had been implicitly counting on was not all within the parcel she controlled. A strip near the road and part of the back access sat in a way that made the proposed event layout impossible without my consent. That was important for two reasons. First, it meant her plan was physically flawed. Second, it meant she had been selling the idea to people, as if the land was simpler and more available than it was. I also learned through the planning packet that her application had included a description of parking access that would have crossed the shared section. That meant she had been planning logistics around land she did not fully control. The more I read, the more obvious it became that she had been hoping to present the county with a neat fait accompli and then pressure me to sign once the wedding timeline was already locked in. It was manipulative, but it was also lazy. She had counted on me being too passive to check the paperwork. She was partly right. I had been passive about the land up until then because I thought family would not get ridiculous over it. That was my mistake. The week before the hearing, Carol tried a different angle. She showed up at my apartment building in the evening with Mason and a sheet cake from the grocery store. I only knew they were there because my neighbor buzzed me and said family was downstairs acting awkward. I went down because I wanted the confrontation on my terms in a public place with no surprise. Carol looked tired and sad in a way that probably would have worked on me a month earlier. She said nobody wanted a fight. She said the county filing was just temporary and could be withdrawn if I would show a little grace. She said Mason was stressed and his fiancé's family was starting to ask questions. Mason stayed mostly silent, which I took as a sign that he did not want to make this worse. I told Carol I was willing to discuss a legitimate purchase, lease, or buyout if she wanted to talk like an adult about ownership. She ignored that and went back to the emotional angle. She said Grandma had always believed in keeping things in the family. I said that was why I had spent years protecting the property instead of letting it sit neglected. Then I asked whether she had told the county she alone could represent the owners, because she thought I would eventually cave. That question finally made her lose the polite face. She said I was obsessed with paperwork and not with family. I told her paperwork was the only reason I knew the truth. Then I said very plainly that I had recorded our phone call and that her own words were not helping her. That made Mason look at her with a kind of stunned disappointment I had not seen before. Carol asked me whether I was threatening to use a private family conversation against her. I told her I was protecting myself with evidence of what had been said. There is a difference between revenge and documentation. She did not like that answer at all. She started crying. I mean the real crying, not the strategic kind. I had no trouble believing the tears were genuine. She probably did believe she had been trying to help. That is what made it so messy. People do not have to think of themselves as villains to do real damage. She said she had only wanted the wedding to happen without conflict. She said she thought I would understand later. She said I was making her look like a liar in front of everyone. I remember looking at the sheet cake and thinking how bizarre it was that she had brought dessert as if sugar could soften a land dispute. I did not comfort her. I did not yell at her either. I told her I would not sign away my share and I would not back the rezoning as filed. Then I told Mason he should move his wedding plans somewhere he actually had authority to use. After that, I went back inside and did not answer the intercom when she rang again. The hearing itself was less dramatic than a movie and more satisfying in the way real bureaucracy can be when the facts are on your side. I showed up with the surveyor's final report, the deed copies, the estate documents, and the recording transcript prepared by the attorney. The county planner already had my written objection on file. Carol arrived with Mason, her husband, and two relatives I assumed had been drafted as support. She looked polished and composed in the way people do when they are determined to make themselves look reasonable in public. Mason looked miserable. His fiancée was not there, which I later learned was because she had already started distancing herself after the ownership issue came out. The planner ran through the application. When she reached the ownership section, I calmly stated that I was one of the recorded owners and that no one had my consent to submit the filing. Then I handed over the survey. Then I handed over the estate paperwork. Then my attorney submitted the written objection. Carol tried to argue that this was all just family logistics and that the land had been understood as available. The planner asked her whether she had all required signatures. Carol said she had acted in good faith based on family discussions. That was the exact kind of statement that sounds better before anybody checks the file. The planner asked again whether the filing reflected actual ownership authorization. Carol hesitated. I think she understood in that moment that she had no clean answer. The planner reviewed the packet, looked at the survey, and then told her the application could not proceed as submitted because consent was incomplete and the proposed use was not properly supported by ownership authority. There was a separate discussion about the false representation in the packet. The planner did not accuse her of fraud on the spot, but she was clear enough that the county would not be moving forward and that the matter could be referred for review if necessary. Carol's face went gray. Mason looked like he wanted the floor to open up under him. I did not gloat. I just sat there and let the paper trail do what paper trails do. That was the real victory, not some dramatic takedown, just facts meeting a lie in a room full of forms. After the hearing, Carol tried one more time to keep it from becoming public by asking if we could handle the family part privately. I told her we already had. Privately was where she had made the false assumptions, filed the packet, and hoped I would fold. Now the public part had paperwork attached to it. That mattered. The county withdrew the application pending proper authorization, which was not going to happen because I refused to sign anything on her terms. Then my attorney sent a formal letter to Carol stating that any further representation of my consent would be treated as unauthorized. The letter also gave her an option to negotiate a lawful buyout of my share through appraisal. That was the first practical opening she had left. I figured she might ignore it out of pride. Instead, she came back hard about a week later. Not with tears this time. With numbers. She had finally realized the wedding issue and the land issue were connected to money in a way she could not bully past. The family had already spent on deposits. The fiancé's family had already heard enough to get nervous. The county had already made things awkward, and now the only way to keep control would have been to buy me out or force a partition fight. I was willing to discuss buyout at fair market value. I was not willing to discount my share because she had gambled wrong. That changed the tone of every conversation after that. Before, she had treated me like the obstacle. Now she had to treat me like a co-owner with leverage. That is a very different posture. The appraiser came out, so did the attorney from my side. The appraisal came in higher than Carol wanted and lower than I had secretly hoped, which is how appraisals usually go. Still, it was fair. More importantly, it was defensible. We were no longer in the emotional theater of family guilt. We were in the boring, blessedly stable world of market value, percentage shares, and closing costs. Carol hated that world, I liked it, because in that world, my share could not be shamed into disappearing. The buyout negotiations dragged on for weeks. During that time, the family had to live with the truth. That is the part people forget when they try to pressure you into silence. Once a dishonest thing is out in the open, everybody else has to react to it too. Mason's fiancé's family backed away from using the land almost immediately. They were not interested in a wedding venue attached to a property dispute and a county filing problem. Mason started moving the wedding to a church hall and then to a different reception space. He was embarrassed, but he also seemed relieved. At one point, he called me to apologize for the part he had played in the misunderstanding. He said he should have asked for copies of the paperwork before assuming anything. I told him that was probably true. I did not blame him for wanting a nicer wedding. I blamed his mother for trying to manufacture authority she did not have. He seemed to understand that. Carol, on the other hand, stopped being so charming around the edges once she realized I was not going to fold. She tried guilt. She tried anger. She tried having other relatives call me to say I was tearing the family apart over dirt. That almost made me laugh because it was such a revealing way to put it. To people who think in terms of entitlement, land is only dirt until they need it for their own plans. One aunt told me I should forgive Carol because she was stressed. I told her stress does not grant ownership authority. Another relative said I was punishing Mason for his mother's mistake. I said Mason was still getting married, just somewhere honest. That shut the conversation down faster than I expected. The funniest part, if you can call it funny, was that the more Carol pushed other relatives to pressure me, the more people noticed she had no actual legal footing. Nobody likes being invited to defend a lie after they hear the words parcel number and ownership share a few too many times. A couple relatives who had initially sided with her got quiet once they saw the survey. That survey was ugly in a very useful way. It did not care about anybody's feelings. It just showed where the land really was. Carol's husband barely spoke to me after that. He seemed annoyed, but not in a useful, decisive way. More in the way of a man who had bet on the wrong horse and did not want to admit he had even been in the race. I was not exactly enjoying myself by then. This kind of thing takes a toll. There were nights I stared at my laptop after work and felt tired in a deep old way. I did not love that my family had turned a piece of inherited land into a courtroom-shaped headache. I did not love having to save screenshots and call logs like a suspicious person. I did not love that my grandmother's memory had become part of a manipulation tactic. But I also did not feel guilty for standing still. That was important. A lot of people try to make you confuse patience with surrender. They are not the same. Patience means waiting while keeping your position. Surrender means giving it up just to stop the noise. I was done surrendering. The buyout finally got serious when Carol's lawyer, yes, she eventually got one, realized the county problem made a forced sale much more expensive than settling with me directly. That was when the tone changed. Suddenly she wanted mediation. Suddenly she wanted everyone to move on. Suddenly she remembered that Grandma loved peace. I almost said no out of principle. Then I thought better of it. I had never wanted to sit on that land forever. I just wanted my share recognized and my rights respected. So I agreed to a mediated buyout at appraised value, plus reimbursement for my portion of the survey and attorney fees related to her unauthorized filing. That fee reimbursement was not me being petty. That was me refusing to pay for the privilege of being lied about. The mediation was awkward, but it worked. Carol was visibly unhappy when the numbers were read out. She had apparently believed I would discount my share for the family, because that was the whole foundation of her strategy. I did not. The agreement included a clear statement that no event use, rezoning, or access changes could be made without full ownership authority. It also included a withdrawal of the county packet and a correction in the record regarding who had authorized what. That correction mattered to me almost as much as the money. Once the closing happened, I finally felt the tension leave my shoulders in a way I had not realized it had been gripping me. The payment was not life-changing rich, but it was enough to do several things I had been putting off for years. I paid off the rest of my car. I fixed the leaky bathroom line. I added a chunk to my emergency fund. I even took a week off work later in the summer and slept more than I had in months. The family fallout was uglier for Carol than for me, which I did not enjoy but also did not control. People who had believed her version were embarrassed. People who had stayed quiet were relieved I had documentation. A few relatives privately admitted they had assumed I would just sign because I was the more practical one. That sentence irritated me at first, but I understood it. Quiet people often get drafted into being the family's convenient backup plan. They get counted on to absorb chaos. I had been doing that for years without noticing how often it was happening. Mason's wedding ended up happening at a venue in town. I did not attend, which was probably for the best. He sent me a polite text afterward thanking me for not escalating things further and saying he hoped we could still be on decent terms someday. I replied that I wished him well. That was true. He had been embarrassed, but he had not lied to the county, and he had not tried to make me give up property by emotional ambush. Carol did not contact me for a while after the closing. When she finally did, it was through a very formal email asking whether I would be willing to help settle a remaining issue with an old access gate. I forwarded it to my attorney and let her handle the response. That may sound cold, but by then I had learned that any loose end around that property could become a new lever if I let it. So I did not let it. A few months later, I drove past the land for the first time since the sale. The farmhouse still looked tired. The barn still leaned. The trees still stood there like they had no idea any of this had happened. I parked at the shoulder and just looked for a minute. I did feel a little sad. That part matters too. Winning something fairly does not always feel clean. Sometimes it feels like a funeral for the version of your family you thought you had. I had grown up thinking Carol was overbearing but ultimately harmless. I had thought she just liked being in charge. I had not realized she was the kind of person who would quietly file paperwork around you and count on social pressure to finish the job. That changed how I saw a lot of older family dynamics too. I started noticing how often people tried to settle things by talking around facts instead of through them. The whole experience made me much less eager to let anybody manage my interests for me just because they were older or louder. It also changed how I handled records at work and at home. Now I keep everything cleaner than before. Receipts get saved. Phone calls get noted. Important conversations get followed by email. I used to think that level of caution made me look paranoid. Now I think it just makes me harder to manipulate. The best part is that I do not walk around angry all the time. That would have been the easy trap. I know people expected me to become bitter after that. I did not. I became more careful. There is a difference. Carol did not lose because I was louder. She lost because I stayed calm long enough to let the paperwork tell the truth. She lost because she tried to quietly rezone land she did not fully control. She lost because she assumed family pressure would outrun documents. And she lost because I recorded the call and did not let her rewrite it later. That is the part I think about most. Not the argument in the kitchen, not the tears, not even the hearing. It is the simple fact that she thought I would give in once the story became emotionally complicated. Instead, I slowed down. I checked the parcel. I ordered the survey. I saved the file. I called the county. I got the recording. I let every piece of the real situation stack up until the lie could not stand on its own. People still in the family sometimes act like the whole thing was just unfortunate. In a way, they are right. It was unfortunate. It was also revealing. If someone is willing to tell the county they speak for you without asking, they are telling you who they are. You do not need to shout to answer that. You just need to keep receipts. In the end, I got my fair share. I got paid properly. I got Carol out of the habit of treating my ownership like a family group project. And I got a lesson that has saved me from at least 2 other weird family situations since then. The lesson was simple. Be polite, be calm, be organized, and never, ever let somebody guilt you into surrendering paperwork just because they are crying in front of other people. That land stopped being a vague family dream and became a paper trail the minute she tried to make me disappear from my own inheritance. She did not count on the fact that I would notice. She counted on me being the bigger person. I ended up being the better prepared one instead.